Hey everyone, this is Dr. Markan, and we are starting off this semester with our first lecture video. This is Chapter 1, The Process of Science. These are our learning objectives, so by the end of this section, you should be able to identify the shared characteristics of natural sciences, understand the process of scientific inquiry, compare inductive reasoning with deductive reasoning, and then describe the goals of basic science and applied science. So stand back, everyone. I'm going to try science. What is science? Science is knowledge about the natural world. It is a process of using observations and experiments to draw evidence-based conclusions. So basically, conclusions that are supported by facts and evidence. Science comes from the Latin scientia, meaning knowledge. So it can be defined as knowledge about the natural world. This class is human biology. What is biology? So anything that ends in ology means the study of. So biology is the study of life. This is a specific science that gathers knowledge about the natural world and about life. Now, we have specific methods of science. This includes careful observation, record keeping, logical and mathematical reasoning, experimentation, and then submitting your conclusions to be reviewed by your peers. So one thing that is common to all forms of science is an ultimate goal to know. That's why we have scientific inquiry. Scientists seek to know the world and the way it operates. We'll talk about scientific method. Now, the scientific method is a method of research with defined steps that include experiments and careful observation. Within the scientific method, we use hypotheses. We form hypotheses. We go by scientific theory, which answers questions such as why? Why do things happen? And we have scientific law, which explains what happens. Now, what is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is a suggested explanation for an event which can be tested. It's generally produced within the context of scientific theory. Scientific theory is a generally accepted, thoroughly tested, and confirmed explanation for a set of observations and phenomena. This scientific theory is the foundation for scientific knowledge. Again, it answers why things happen. And we have a lot of scientific theories out there. For example, we'll be learning about the theory of evolution. Charles Darwin came up with this theory that we as humans developed from earlier species to eventually become human beings, walking around on two legs, two arms, and we've evolved from a more primitive species, say, monkeys. So there are a lot of theories, scientific theories, that explain why things happen. Scientific laws are different from scientific theories. Scientific laws describe how elements of nature will behave under certain specific conditions. We have laws such as the law of gravity and the law of thermodynamics, and we know that Sir Isaac Newton actually postulated a lot of these laws. Now, scientific laws are often expressed in mathematical formulas. Scientific laws are empirical conclusions. Empirical meaning they are backed by evidence, consistent evidence, and they are conclusions that are reached by scientific method. Scientific laws are different from scientific theory in that they state what always happens. If we drop an apple, it will always fall to the ground. It doesn't explain why things happen, it just explains what always happens. And this is through proven testing over and over. We have consistent results over and over. Now here are the steps of the scientific method. So the scientific method, as described in figure 1.18 in the book, is a series of defined steps that include experiments and careful observation. If a hypothesis is not supported by the data from the experiment, a new hypothesis can be proposed. So first, you as a scientist and a biologist make an observation. Then you form a question, ask a question. From the question, you form a hypothesis that answers the question. You can then try to make a prediction based on the hypothesis. You will then perform an experiment to test that prediction and then analyze the results of that experiment. If the hypothesis is supported by your experiment, you can report the results. However, if the hypothesis is not supported by your experiment, you will still report the results. However, you will try again by forming a new hypothesis that will hopefully answer the original question, and then you go through the steps again until you find a hypothesis that is supported by your experiment. But overall, you always report your results. Now, we talked about scientific inquiry back then. Scientific inquiry has two methods that allow scientists to understand the world and the way it operates. So these two methods are inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning uses related observations to arrive at a general conclusion. So for example, a scientist can make observations and then record them. These observations or data can be either descriptive, qualitative, or consisting of numbers, which is quantitative. This raw data can then be supplemented with drawings, pictures, photos, or videos. From these many observations, the scientist can then infer conclusions or inductions based on evidence. Okay, so this is through observation. Now, inductive reasoning involves formulating generalizations that are inferred from careful observation and the analysis of a large amount of data. Whereas deductive reasoning is used in hypotheses-based science. It uses a general principle or law to forecast or predict specific results. From these general principles, a scientist can then predict specific results that would be valid as long as the general principles are valid. The book uses an example with regards to prediction of climate. So if the climate is becoming warmer in a region, then distribution of plants and animals would change. So there is a difference between inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. However, both types of logical thinking are related to the two main pathways of scientific study, which we will talk about. So again, both types of logical thinking are related to the two main pathways of scientific study. We have descriptive or discovery science, and we have hypothesis-based science. So descriptive science aims to observe, explore, and discover. I use the example of Star Trek, the final frontier. So their mission was to observe, explore, and discover. Hypothesis-based science begins with a specific question or problem. It has a potential answer or solution that can be tested. Now, this figure, 1.17 in your book, is of Sir Francis Bacon. He is credited with being the first to document the scientific method. So while descriptive science and hypothesis-based science are different, often the boundary between the two is a little blurred. We know that scientific endeavors combine both approaches. So we know that observations will lead to questions. questions will lead to forming a hypothesis as a possible answer to those questions. And then the hypothesis is tested. So both descriptive science and hypothesis-based science they work together. Now, we want to talk about what do you need to know about evaluating science in the news. Oftentimes, people are referencing Google and performing their own research, quote unquote. And it's kind of hard to decide, not having a strong science background, what is true versus what is false. How can we decipher true scientific fact versus opinions and observations that might not be backed by evidence? So how do we evaluate science in the news? First, we want to check the source of the news. Is it reputable? Is it a reputable, objective source with the expertise to report on the science? So we can compare, for example, the San Francisco Chronicle versus an opinionated document or opinionated source such as The Onion. We know that The Onion actually produces some pretty satirical, funny type articles, which is fun to read every now and then, but we can't really say that The Onion is a reputable source of information. And then more and more these days, we talk about media bias in the news. There are political leanings, and we know that some news sources are leaning towards either a more liberal view versus a conservative view. Politics has invaded our media, and it's really up to you how you interpret the news. I'm not going to talk about politics or anything, but know that there are specific news sources that might lean extremely to the left versus extremely to the right. And it's really up to you to kind of decide, where the true facts start. So you don't want to go, anywhere to the extreme sides. You kind of want to stick to news sources that are more towards the mainstream or middle. These news sources are better at reporting the news with as little bias as possible. Although one side might say that, these sources are fake news, or that they're not reputable, or other such things. But again, it's really up to your interpretation. And for the most part, these news sources are pretty good at just reporting facts. Another way to kind of decipher how to evaluate science in the news is to check the source of the research. Would a trusted university or government lab be more reliable versus a company or an advocacy group? I would think so. I worked in research before, and research, we have evidence to back our claims, versus a company that sells products that might not have been tested by control. These might not be as reliable. You want to also check that the research is reported properly. Again, we talk about media bias, and you want to stick to just the facts. Now, to evaluate a scientific claim, we need to look closely at how the science was done. We want to make sure that the scientific method was performed in order to trust a scientific claim. We want to make sure that the scientific method included initial observations, a study with peer-reviewed scientific literature, used to make a scientific hypothesis that are testable and falsifiable. Then you want to make sure that these hypotheses are tested and carried out through controlled experiments. You want to make sure that there is correct analysis of the experimental data from which a conclusion can be supported by the data. Again, if the results do not support the hypothesis, you test your other alternatives hypotheses. If the results do support the hypotheses, you want to continue testing to make sure that the results are consistent throughout the different experiments. Once you have an experiment that has a hypothesis that is supported by consistent positive results or negative results, you want to publish these results in a scientific peer-reviewed publication. And these can then be used to, again, help out more observations in scientific experiments. But for most part, you want to make sure that scientific claims have been backed by the scientific method. So again, just a closer look of the scientific process that I explained. So here we have initial observations that generate questions. So forming a hypothesis, and we'll have multiple questions. You form anywhere from 1 to 4 questions. And then you study peer-reviewed scientific literature to see if there are previous studies that kind of took a look at these questions. Again, making a scientific hypotheses that are testable and falsifiable. And then you may have anywhere from 1 to 4 or maybe more hypotheses, and you carry out controlled experiments for each one. You want to rigorously test this hypothesis with more experiments, increase your population data. You then want to analyze this experimental data, make conclusions supported by your data. If the results support the hypotheses, again, continue testing, just to build more data to support this hypothesis. If they don't support the hypothesis, if the results do not support the hypothesis, then you will test an alternative hypothesis. So once you can make a conclusion that's supported by a sufficient amount of data, you then attempt to write and publish the results in a peer-reviewed publication. And the writing process is a long process with a lot of editing. Make sure you have material and references that you can use for citations and all that fun stuff. So science is a process. We start off having initial observations that generate questions. So we ask questions. For example, I wonder if coffee can influence mental performance. I know the answer to that, but perhaps I'm only using anecdotal evidence. And this is observations that have not been tested. Now, anecdotal evidence are not always a reliable source of information. And why is that? Because it's not evidence-based. But it can help lead to formulate more questions. Now, studying previous research that have been published gives a sense of what information currently exists on the subject of interest. So make sure to use and study peer-reviewed scientific literature. Be able to discern and differentiate scientific literature that has been peer-reviewed versus articles that might not have studies to back their information. Then you form your scientific hypotheses. You want to make scientific hypotheses that are testable as well as falsifiable. So you can form many different numbers of hypotheses. If you are able to test one and it doesn't work out and you don't have data to support that hypothesis, you move on to your next hypothesis. Scientific hypothesis is a potential explanation for a scientific observation or question. Now, scientific hypotheses must be testable and falsifiable. We must be able to run a test or experiment to see whether or not this hypothesis works out. So testable meaning can be assessed using carefully designed experiments or non-experimental studies. Falsifiable meaning it can be ruled out by data to show that the hypothesis does not explain the observation. So would you consider these statements to be testable and falsifiable hypotheses? So first, spaced studying is better than cramming for an exam. HIV can be transmitted by cat fleas. 3, the earth was created by an all-powerful being. Now note, not all explanations are scientific hypotheses. Some just cannot be backed by science. So just a quick recap: observation to form questions, to form hypotheses, and observation in this case, it seems like every time I have coffee, I do better on an exam. Question. So this is the question that is formed. Does drinking caffeine improve exam performance? Yes. I'm just kidding. This is something that you should often ask yourself. Hypotheses that is formed. Drinking caffeinated coffee improves test performance. Not decaf coffee, which I don't even know why it exists, but caffeinated coffee. So once we form our hypotheses, we then can perform an experiment. So an experiment is a carefully designed test, and the results will either support or rule out a hypothesis. So you carry out controlled experiments, having a control group versus an experimental group. Note your dependent and independent variables. And you want to create a large sample size. Now, how do you determine sample size? What you do is see if any other or previous peer-reviewed articles have performed this experiment or taken a look at the hypotheses that you're trying to prove and test. See what their population size is, and maybe conduct a similar experiment where you have the same population size or maybe a larger population size. For me, a larger population size generally is better than having a smaller population size. The more data that can support your hypothesis and conclusion, the better. So once you get your data, you want to analyze this experimental data. You then make conclusions that are supported by your data. And at this point, you can either conclude that the results do support the hypotheses or they do not support the hypotheses. And again, according to that schematic that we saw previously, if the results do support the hypotheses, you can continue carrying out more controlled experiments to populate more data to show that more and more conclusions are supported by that data. And at which point, once you have results that support hypotheses, you record this. You write this up in a paper to be peer-reviewed, and hopefully this paper will get published so that other scientists can benefit from your work. Now, in your worksheet that is given to you on Canvas, you do have a scientific method type worksheet. So hypothesis will be drinking caffeinated coffee improves test performance, and the goal is to design a simple experiment to test the hypothesis. Originally you were supposed to work in groups, but this is an independent worksheet that you will be working alone and filling out. So drawing conclusions. Confidence in scientific findings is increased by repetition, or the number of times an experiment is repeated. The sample size is the number of experimental subjects. And generally speaking, the larger the sample size, the better it is to have cases that support your findings. So if you take a look at these two graphs, which graph better supports the conclusion that caffeine improves memory? So here you have data from only 8 participants. So we can see that we have 8 participants in this study. They are asked to take a memory test and given different milligrams of caffeine per day. Now, so this data will suggest a small effect of caffeine on memory. However, we have this graph right here that shows data from dozens of participants. And we can see the trend kind of moving along with an increase in score with an increased amount of milligrams of caffeine per day. So the population size, the sample size has increased, and we can see more cases are showing to support the conclusion that caffeine improves memory. So these data show a more convincing effect of caffeine on memory. So when you start observing, you want to make sure you make careful observations. There is a method to finding patterns. So we talk about correlation. Correlation is a consistent relationship between variables. So here we can see the correlation of the different causes of autism. We can make a correlation saying that cases of autism has increased with the increase in the amount of organic food sales. So this is something that we observe. However, the data may show correlation between 2 variables, but it does not prove that one variable causes the other. It's something we observe. However, like you often hear, correlation does not mean causation. So just because we have an increase in organic food sales, that does not necessarily mean that we'll have an increase in the amount of diagnosed cases of autism. And I worked in autism research, and I can confidently say that this correlation does not mean that organic food sales increase the amount of cases of autism. This is why you have to do experimentation. You have to have studies, scientific studies, that will support your observations. Again, correlation does not mean causation. You'll find this often, as I've kind of talked about with some of the previous classes, that people were finding that in relation to what's going on, the drug hydroxychloroquine, the effect of the drug on COVID has come into question, and people, some doctors or some people are finding that it does improve cases. However, these were only observational studies. These weren't actual randomized controlled studies that showed the effects of COVID, the effects of hydroxychloroquine on COVID. The randomized controlled studies that were performed on a large group of patients actually showed no effect of hydroxychloroquine on the COVID patients. So that's why it was actually removed from emergency treatment by the FDA. So when you look at articles, you want to make sure that the articles and the people that are kind of talking about certain drugs, whether they are referencing observational studies versus randomized controlled studies. So one of the objectives is to kind of differentiate between basic and applied science. So basic science, the main goal of basic science is to expand knowledge without any expectation of short-term practical application of that knowledge. It's basically to find out more knowledge. Whereas applied science, the main goal of applied science is to solve practical problems through research. Now, these seem like two totally different types of science, but know that basic and applied science can be used together in order to, improve getting more knowledge about our natural world. That's what science is. So guys, that was the first lecture video for chapter 1, and there will be another lecture video to the second part of this chapter focusing on what is science.